In Campbelltown, New South Wales, about 100 kilometres from Sydney, every November the city holds one of the world's most extraordinary festivals. It is to celebrate the ghost of an ex-convict who was murdered in the town more than 160 years ago. For 6 days, the town develops ghost fever, with thousands of people lining the streets for a parade of decorated floats, pipers, brass bands, and of course, ghosts in costume. It's all in honour of Australia's most famous and cherished phantom, the spirit of an ex-convict called Fred Fisher, who once operated a small farm on the edge of town. The legend of Fisher's ghost is part of Australia's folklore, but the story is founded on historical facts.
Fred Fisher was an industrious man determined to rise above his convict past. He worked hard on his small property and enjoyed the friendship and respect of the township. Fred was last seen alive on afternoon in 1826, mending fences in a paddock near a small creek. Court records show that while he was working, he was visited by a more prosperous farmer called George Worrall, who argued with Fred over the boundary of the fence between their two properties. But the terrible fate of Fred Fisher wasn't discovered until months later. It's not the brutal murder of Fred that the people of Campbelltown celebrate every year. It's his ghost. The story has come to symbolize that good does triumph over evil and the victory of the little Aussie battler over the bigger, more prominent folk.
As far as the townspeople knew, Fred Fisher had simply vanished. In the weeks that followed, George fabricated the story that Fred had sold him his farm before fleeing to England to escape a forgery charge. George began selling up Fisher's goods, and although the townsfolk were suspicious, nothing could be proved. He had disposed of Fisher's body by dragging it to a small creek and burying it in a shallow grave. About 3 months after Fisher's disappearance, a local resident, John Farley, came rushing, white-faced, into the local pub, claiming he had seen Fisher's ghost sitting on the handrails of a fence. He said the apparition had slowly turned and pointed towards the creek. This ghostly sighting kept occurring over many nights, the figure on the fence always pointing towards the creek. And a short time later, after too many people had made the same claims of seeing this ghostly figure, Aboriginal trackers were called in and eventually guided police to the body in the exact spot indicated by the ghost. George was arrested, convicted and hanged for the crime. The story became a well-known legend, and for the past century and a half, locals claim that Fisher's ghost can still be seen sitting on the fence, pointing accusingly to where he was dragged to the creek by George Worrall. Fred was not about to let anyone forget what had happened to him. Of course, there is scepticism as to whether these events actually happened the way history has written it, but we do know that Fred Fisher existed and that he was indeed murdered by George Worrall. As to the ghostly sightings, we'll leave that up to you. The following is a poem written by Evan Schnell called The Ghost of Fred Fisher, and it is written and recorded in some Aussie terminology, so I hope people from overseas will excuse some of the words that they may not understand. Now, I've heard it said by skeptics that my tale is just that, an old yarn about a ghost on a rail where I once sat. But I'll tell you what happened, and I know better than most, because I'm Frederick George James Fisher. Well, at least I am his ghost. I travelled as a convict from Portsmouth to New South Wales. It was a mournful journey beneath the billowing sails. We never saw the sun before we'd arrived at the quay, and land was a glorious sight after 6 months at sea.
2,207 days later, I was free. Well, I had a ticket to leave, so free as I could be. I was granted 30 acres after I had been released, on condition I go to church and report to the priest. I obeyed the rules explicitly for nigh on 4 years, until I was taken down by one of my fellow peers. Bill Booker was a carpenter doing some work for me, but I could see that the work he'd done wasn't worth his fee.
So when I gave him the money that I thought he was due, he attacked me with his chisel and tried to run me through. I stabbed him in self-defence, but I was thrown in the clink. So I gave my neighbour George the authority in ink to farm my block like it was his own until I got out. I now know that was a bad idea, because he was a lout. But while I was in the jail, he looked after my place well. He milked my Frisians and kept all my chooks fed for a spell. After my lag was over on the way back to the scrub, I dropped in for a pint with the boys at the local pub. I was in a hurry and could share one only drink with them, and when I left the pub I walked into some real mayhem. As I crossed the rickety bridge I was hit in the head. Then the cur beat me until I was well and truly dead. He bashed my head in with a post and then he buried me up the creek in a muddy marsh where nobody could see.
Then I came back as a ghost to show a neighboring mate where my body was lying in its gruesome mangled state. I thought John Farley could do with the 20 quid reward, so I pointed out to him where my body had been stored. A copper came round and searched the creek I had pointed to and found my rotting corpse after the drying of the dew. George had been spinning a yarn about me going abroad while I was up the creek, and his tale had me overawed.
He reckoned I'd gone back to Mother England late one night by sneaking on board a ship out of the governor's sight. But when the cops found my body, George Worrell's yarn was checked, and the cracks in his story made him the primary suspect. Then they locked him up because he was wearing my dacks and socks. He was hanged off the drop near Sydney Harbour at the Rocks. Since George was executed, I've played pranks round the place. 'Cause I can. 'Cause tomfoolery without it leaving a trace. But it's hard to chat with people when they all run away. And if you've just calmed down, I'd love to hear about your day. I switched the lights off in the town orchestra pit one night, and I'm really sorry the folks weren't supposed to get such a fright. In 1973, an old bridge rail from my creek was taken to the racetrack, which I thought was pretty weak. So 5 times I washed out the Campbelltown picnic races by causing rain, which put a dampener on their airs and graces.
My rail was moved, and although it wasn't back in the mud, it was taken from the track, so I stopped their race day flood. Now I try to just chew the fat with some city folk, 'cause I like to share a mag, and I do love a good joke. So you can see I'm a nice bloke who just likes to have fun. And about the race, I knew the horse you'd backed wouldn't have won. So if you ever see me, remember I'm here to stay. And if you want, come up and chat. I'd love to say, g'day.